Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 236, The Combat Zone, with Jan Brogan. Hi, I'm Jake. In just a few minutes, I'm going to be joined by Jan Brogan, author of the recent book, The Combat Zone, Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice. In the book, Jan turns her impressive research and reporting skills on the case of Andy Puopolo, a 21-year-old Harvard football player who was killed in a fight in the combat zone in 1976. The case would pit one of the most privileged groups at the most privileged school in the world against three poor black men on the margins of society, while in the background, Boston tore itself apart on racial lines. The book plumbs the depths of white working-class Boston's racial resentments during the busing era, a criminal justice system that stacked the deck against black defendants, and a police department that was compromised at its core by organized crime. It highlights the street violence that helped cement Boston's reputation as the most racist city in the country, as well as the two trials that came to diametrically opposite verdicts in the same city just a couple of years apart. It also puts the reader in the mind of the younger brother of the victim, left behind to deal with his feelings of grief and guilt while wrestling with the possibility of revenge. But before we talk about the Puopolo case, I just want to pause and thank John S., who recently gave us a generous gift on PayPal, and everyone who supports the show on Patreon. Sponsoring Hub History on Patreon means committing to giving us $2, $5, or even $10 a month. Our sponsors' consistent support means that we have a steady source of funding to be able to purchase access to research databases, pay for audio processing tools to clean up how I and our guests sound, and get access to web hosting and security and podcast media hosting to get our words to your ears. If you're not yet supporting the show and you'd like to start, just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. Our sponsors are the ones who make it possible for us to keep making Hub History. So a heartfelt thank you to all our new and returning sponsors. Now it's time for this week's main topic. Jan Brogan is an award-winning journalist and novelist living in the Boston area. She's been a staff writer for the Providence Journal and Worcester Telegram, and her pieces have appeared in The Globe, Boston Magazine, and several other periodicals. When she's wearing her novelist hat, she writes mystery novels that feature a journalist as the intrepid investigator, rather than a more traditional hard-boiled detective. Her Hallia Hearn series is anchored by a confidential source, which has been optioned by Transactional Pictures for development into a television series. Her new nonfiction book is The Combat Zone, Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice, which is in stores now. At the heart of the book is a terrible crime: the 1976 stabbing of Andy Puopolo, a white Harvard football player, at the hands of a black man who was characterized in court as a pimp. The crime took place in the Combat Zone, the nearly lawless red light district at the heart of Boston that was caught up in what Time magazine called the age of porno. The case played out against the backdrop of the peak of racist violence during the busing conflict, with the trial becoming a proxy for white rage against efforts to desegregate Boston's schools. Jan was incredibly generous with her time, and somehow we still barely scratched the surface of the Puopolo story, which sells the book short. Beyond our conversation, Combat Zone is the story of racial tension in Boston in the explosive late 70s, and a trial that changed Massachusetts law seemingly forever. As I go back and listen to our conversation, there are times when we seem to dance around the most sensitive aspects of the case. In retrospect, that may have been because I assumed that we would disagree on some of the fundamentals of the story. Jan seems more receptive to the idea that Andy Puopolo and the Harvard football team were innocent victims of a crime. And maybe I worked in Harvard Square bars for too long, but I tend to believe the defense's theory from the second trial, that Andy and the football team were a drunken wolf pack who went into the zone looking for trouble. I think that you need to pick up a copy of the book, using our affiliate link, which you can find at hubhistory.com/236. Read it for yourself and see which version of events convinces you, and whether you think justice was done at the first or the second trial. I'll also note that there's an occasional crackling sound from a loose connection in Jan's mic, It gets better as our conversation goes on, but it never quite goes away. I did my best to minimize it in editing, but please forgive the sections when I wasn't quite successful. I'm joined now by Jan Brogan, author of The Combat Zone: Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice. The book opens with a party at the Harvard Club in Boston celebrating the end of the 1976 football season, and then it follows the players to an after party in the combat zone. I love the way it starts out because it sets up these two environments and these two groups of characters who just couldn't be more different from one another. Can you just set the stage and talk a little bit about what the Harvard Club would have been like?
It was, just this beautiful old world steeping with tradition. Everything at Harvard was steeped in tradition. The football players were there to congratulate them for their year.
Was it a winning season?
They were favorites to win, and they did not. So it was a disappointing season, but they were still, celebrating the end of it. Ethel Kennedy was there to award the scholarship in her husband's name. It was a very classy event.
So then nearly the whole team, plus the equipment manager, some other add-ons, go to the combat zone. First of all, where in Boston is this district that we're talking about? And then what sort of legal businesses were operating there? And then what other maybe less legal entertainment could you find there? Okay,
so it's like a 4-block area centered around Lower Washington. A lot of the business fronts are on Washington, parts of LaGrange and Boylston Street, and some of Essex and Beach. It's bounded on one side by Neelan Street. It's right next to Chinatown, and kind of downtown Crossing on the other side.
Almost what we just think of as the theater district today.
Yes.
Just other theaters at the time.
And so at the time, I think there were like 35, 36 adult entertainment enterprises there, like strip clubs, X-rated movies were big then. There's a gay steam bath, these little peep shows where people go, you put in a quarter for the porn reel to go. You have to remember, this is before the internet or VCRs. So this is where people went to get their pornography. Adult bookstores. There was lots of prostitution. So it's centered around Liberty Tree Square. There's sort of it's like a triangle off Washington and on Boylston. In 1976, which is the year this happened, that would have been just on a Saturday night, that just would have been packed with prostitutes, all waiting for the men to come out of the strip clubs.
We have the Harvard players then descending into this environment.
Right. It was a Harvard tradition because it was a place of danger. People got mugged. They got pickpocketed. There were fist fights. You went there for the excitement of the danger. At BC, they called it force night because you went in force. The team went in force because then it was safer.
And at some point, I'm not sure if it was when the club closed or when they decided they had enough, they leave the strip club and there's an interaction with these two sex workers, both of whom are Black, one of whom you say was only 16 at the time.
Right. They're at the Naked Eye. They leave the Naked Eye and they're headed to their cars. And one group of maybe 6 football players and the equipment manager walk past the Carnival Lounge. And as they're walking by, a couple of young Black women dressed as prostitutes start talking to them. And some of them are ignoring them because just in the news the week before, there had been a lot about what was called the robber whore scheme, which was women dressed as prostitutes would sidle up to men. It was called the fondle. They would fondle them, and while they were distracted, they would pickpocket them. So some of the students knew about it and told them to get lost, but some of them were drunk, and there was a conversation about having $50 in their wallet and what were their charges, and they all ended up back at the Harvard van. One of the women that got in, I think it was a 16-year-old, and she was there. They all agree for about 2 or 3 minutes. There's discussion about having her come back to the frat, and she bolts, and he realizes the wallet is gone. And that's when the trouble starts.
There's one young man who's at the center of the story, and I'm going to have to go to you for the pronunciation. Is it Andy Puopolo?
Yeah, it's Andy Puopolo. he's in a different car with another student, and they're just waiting for the driver. As the first group chases the prostitute down Boylston Street, the friends who are about to get into the car, they call them. They say, there she goes. There they got Charlie's wallet. Chase her. So a couple of those kids start chasing the prostitute. And so now you've got maybe 8 Harvard football players chasing this young black woman down the street. She stumbles on the street. One of the Harvard football players who reaches her first picks her up, and she screams at him, "I don't have the wallet." So he says, okay, and he lets her go. Someone puts her in a taxi, and another black guy comes and all of a sudden knocks down the guy who picked her up. And they jump to their feet just as all the other Harvard football players arrive, and they wind up around the T station on Boylston Street, like at the edge of the common. Mm-hmm. And Tom Lincoln says, he doesn't have the wallet, let's go home. And just as they're about to turn, another black guy comes in and he stabs Tom Lincoln.
These football players very much feel like they're the victims in this situation. They've been robbed. They feel like they're trying to right something that's been done wrong. But the way it presents to anybody who happened by after the first instant would have been, oh, here's this dozen or more big guys chasing after one or two much smaller, younger in one case, girl. I feel like it could be very confusing for both parties involved.
The 16-year-old was in a different area at this point, but still, she's only 21. She's black, and they're all white.
There were black members of the Harvard football team, and they were there that night. But it sounds like from your description that not one of them participated in this chase and then the fight that ensued. Is that right?
I spoke to one of them, and he said, that was in the middle of busing, They weren't going to subject themselves to chasing a prostitute and get caught by cops or get beat up. They were too smart to get involved.
Yeah, it seems like as sort of a very privileged group of the football team within a very privileged group, a lot of the white players probably felt a lot of license to that. A lot of the sort of boys will be boys behavior they knew they would get away with up to a certain point of escalation. And maybe the black players didn't have that same freedom.
I don't think it was that thought out, to tell you the truth. Yeah. I actually think they stole Charlie's wallet, and Charlie went after them. And I think they went after Charlie to make sure he didn't get in trouble.
They end up sort of arranged around the T station on Boylston Street, and a fist fight happens. There's a moment of escalation. What was the outcome?
Leon Easterling jumps in and stabs Tom Lincoln. And they all say, knives. Oh my God, he's got knives. And they all turn around and bolt. All the Harvard players turn around and bolt and run back to the van. And this is where they stop being, if there's any instant that if they're the aggressors, they're no longer the aggressors. Then they get chased back. All of them get into the van except Charlie. And then there's another guy who's a mystery, the man in the cranberry jacket. Some people say he's black, some people say he's white, some people say he's Hispanic, but everybody agrees on the cranberry jacket. And he pulls Charlie out by the tines and starts beating him against the door. He must have been pretty big because Charlie was a big guy, but he was also very drunk. Andy had, by this point, gotten out of the back of his car. And at that moment, he sees his teammate, Charlie, being beaten against the side of the van. He grew up in the city. He's a city kid from the North End. He goes in to help his friend. Edward Soares raises his fists and they get into a fist fight. And then Easterling jumps over Soares' back and stabs Andy.
In the chest, it sounds like?
Well, first it's in the chest. And then and another teammate appears, Scott Coolidge, and he picks Andy up and he grabs him and he says, let's get out of here. And Andy says, yes. And at this point, Andy's okay. And they're retreating from the alley. They're back on Boylston, and Easterling comes at him his second time. And this time he takes the knife and he stabs him in the stomach and twists it by, according to the medical testimony, 6 inches up into the heart and punctures the heart in 2 different places. Police are there within a matter of seconds, and they take Andy to Tufts, which is just down the street. to the emergency room. He arrives dead on arrival, but they're able to restart his heart and take him into surgery.
At the same time, Tom Lincoln's getting taken to Mass General. What was his condition when he got taken in?
He was stable. It was a serious wound, but it wasn't life-threatening.
Pretty immediately, Andy's family is going to come into Tufts while he's still in emergency trauma surgery. We should take a minute and introduce the Puopolos. You said that Andy was a city kid and that they were from the North End.
Andrew Puopolo Sr., the father, is an Italian immigrant. He came at age 5, and his mother's from Italian descent, and their families are in the North End. And they raised the kids mostly in the two-bedroom apartment over a leather goods shop in the North End till they're like 14 and 12, I think. And then they have an older sister who's like 16, and that's why they moved, because she's sleeping in the Castro convertible couch in the living room. The younger brother said, we thought we had it made because we had our own bathroom. A lot of apartments in the North End did not have their own bathrooms. You shared one. So they moved to a modest house in the Jamaica Plain. That's where he is when he's in college. Obviously he's living at the Harvard dorm, but that's where his parents' house is. So they come from JP. He's in surgery, and they wait the night, and at that point the emergency room is just packed.
And not only friends and teammates and supporters and families, but also it seems like outside the emergency room there is every form of media in New England. It's
immediately a big story.
There are a couple of trends in Boston at that time to help explain sort of the intense interest in this case. The busing controversy, which we've hinted at a little bit, and the porno panic.
It's hard to wrap your head around just how violent the protesting over busing was. Boston is very ethnically divided. Boston's very poor to start off with. I mean, cities in general weren't doing well. Boston was really even poorer. And that's because the middle class had moved out in the 60s and early 70s, leaving only the very rich and the poor. And the poor at that time were white. It's a very poor neighborhood. And these poor neighborhoods are told, you're getting bussed. And so Charlestown and Southie were just up in arms. They were protesting. Thousands of people would be in the streets. Grown adults were throwing rocks at buses full of black children coming to school, trying to imagine that. Kids were getting stabbed, and, when you got stabbed in the street, people were rioting in the streets. It was a very violent place. So it's very racially tense. Then you have the pornography thing, which is actually the bigger thing at the moment. So at the time, X-rated movie houses in downtowns were relatively new, and Supreme Court decisions said that the First Amendment protected them. Boston dealt with it. Boston, the city that banned everything, the city of Puritans, had created an adult entertainment district. It was very controversial. Even though the city did it to restrict the growth of the business, it was viewed as license. And it was Harvard, right? A Harvard white kid had gotten stabbed in the combat zone. This kind of proved how stupid Boston was for taking this approach.
It sounds like the Boston Police Department also took a very hands-off approach to the combat zone, while the Angiulo crime family took a hands-on approach.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about how those two groups interacted with the combat zone?
Yeah, so I guess some of their studies said that 40 to 50% of the businesses were owned by the mob. This is the mob in its heyday. This is a couple years after the Godfather movies, which gave them kind of this patina of glamour. While they're making, I estimated like in today's dollars, about $500,000 a week off their businesses. They are flush with cash, and Boston police are at this point really corrupt. DeGrazia, the police commissioner, had been brought in to clean up the department. The commissioner himself starts a 32-month secret investigation into his own police force and feels he's got to make it public rather than give it to the mayor. And it reveals that they're drinking at the bars in the clubs for free. One of the things DeGrazia said was, what shocked him was how cheaply a cop could be bought. Not all of them, but like at least he said in the combat zone, 50%. They often would sabotage their own investigations by telling off the mob. They would basically arrest small-time hustlers who weren't connected, so they had some arrests and leave alone, any mob-related activity. They would extort sex from the prostitutes. And this report illuminates this Robert Hoare scheme. So a week before this happens, in the news, people are reading that there's this new wrinkle to the Robert Hoare scheme where the women have male protectors who, if, they get caught doing it, will come in and protect them from the mad Mark. It's going to be big news in Boston because, it's Harvard, it's white kids, it's black defendants, and it's big news nationwide, mostly because of the pornography.
Thank you for taking that diversion with me from Andy Puopolo's hospital bed to get a little bit of the background. You said that he was brought in dead on arrival, but the doctors were able to restart his heart. It sounded like there was a lot of optimism that first night and maybe the first morning. What was the prognosis for Andy at first?
The fact that they could restart his heart, they considered a miracle. And they put some light in his eyes and they see the pupils dilate. So they think they got him there in time. So it's supposed to be a miracle. And that's what, at the press conference the next morning, the police in District 1 are giving. These police got them there to the hospital in time. This is the same District 1 that has gotten all this criticism, right? Yeah. So now it's, at that point, the information they have is that he's going to be okay because of their fast action. And this is the news that goes out.
And then Andrew Sr. and his little brother, Danny, right?
Yep. His sister and his mother, Helen, they're coming back to the hospital after like an hour to
go get some fresh clothes, maybe have a cup of coffee, get cleaned up. And the story changes then. So
when they come back to see him, he's immediately seizing. A seizure is a sign that the oxygen's lacking in his brain. And about then, the doctors, I think, guessed that they were wrong. But the family, still wants to believe in the miracle. And in the beginning, he looks so healthy and, he's on, all sorts of life support, but he's strong and he's healthy and he's a fighter. And, and the whole city wants to believe he's going to fight his way through it. The city wants a happy ending.
And it becomes, spectacle doesn't even begin to describe it. Not even the media spectacle, but just all the political leaders, the religious leaders, the hacks who are coming in to somehow get a part of this Puopolo story. They're using him to grandstand with their opinions about the combat zone, right? What's the sort of the balance of opinion there?
I don't know if they're using him to grandstand. I would say the city wasn't all that happy about the combat zone. So immediately people are calling for the shutting down of the combat zone. Ray Flynn, who goes on to become the mayor, he actually had coached Andy Puopolo. So he knew him. And he'd been at the meeting opposing the zoning from the start because he knew the area from his youth. So he'd been opposed to it all along, but now the next day he's down there with a petition to shut it down. I actually think with Ray Flynn, it was a very sincere feeling. He goes on to become the ambassador to Rome. He's a very religious man, and he did not like the combat zone. And the combat zone was a wild place, Right. It was wild, but it was, then it was also, it was the beginning, it was the sexual revolution, right? So it wasn't without social value. It was the place where gays could come, where there was a steam bath, there were some gay bars nearby. An interracial couple could live in one of the few apartments. My husband calls it the pornographic DMZ. Yeah. In the rest of the city, if you were Italian, you couldn't go into Southie and vice versa, but everybody would sit at the bars together in the combat zone.
A group of business leaders in what they call the Boston Adult District tried to play up that value that the combat zone brought, right? With a PR campaign that I thought was really interesting. Who did they get to speak for the adult businesses?
Yeah, so It was called, I love the name of the acronym for the organization was BAD. Boston Adult District? Adult Interest District, yeah. So they had a spokeswoman, Deborah Beckerman, who was a former dancer. She's very attractive. She likes the spotlight, and she's smart, and she's well-spoken. And she also has a little PR background. So I think she might have done some PR for one of the hospitals or something.
So how does she frame the problem, quote unquote, in the zone?
She says the police are responsible for Puopolo's murder. And this is before he's even dead. She blames it on, she says that the businesses were calling for more police presence in the district, which is, it's sort of, they might have been, but they were also, wooing them with alcohol. So it's, but, some of the prostitutes who call themselves the legitimate prostitutes are mad about this pickpocket scheme because it's driving away business, right? It doesn't make them look good. Immediately following the murder, the same week, a state trooper dies after a fist fight in this combat zone. So the streets are flooded with police. It goes from no police to just so much police presence that there's no, the prostitutes are basically cleared of the area. There's nothing going on. The strip clubs are empty. Business is off, and they organize. Well, they were actually organized before this happened, but this is where they really get get a lot of press.
I find some of her arguments pretty convincing. Especially around the lack of policing. That certainly wouldn't be the first time that police either were paid to look the other way or just didn't give as much protection to people or areas they thought were less deserving of it.
Well, yeah. Part of the deal was when they zoned it, they were supposed to spruce up the area and and increase police presence, and neither of those two things happened.
So we have the porno plague driving everybody's interest in the case to a near frenzy as Andy's condition starts to get worse. He was at Tufts for 31 days in all. How did the trajectory of his condition fare after that sort of initial burst of hope?
He flatlines pretty early, and doctors talk about pulling the plug, but they're also cautious about it because this is 1976, and the Karen Ann Quinlan case was only, I think, maybe 6 months to 8 months before.
For our listeners, what is the Karen Ann Quinlan case?
Oh, so Karen Ann Quinlan, who died who overdosed in New Jersey and was basically a vegetable. Her family wanted to remove her from life support, arguing that she was gone, and they didn't want to see their daughter waste away on life support. And they had to go to court to be able to take her off life support. They did not have that right. That case established the precedent that you could take somebody off life support. But still, it was a relatively new concept. And, the Puopolos are very religious people, and they were praying for a miracle.
And so the family basically never even seriously considers ending the life support measures.
No, they never do that. He dies on life support.
And so how did he finally die? What was the cause?
Well, he just wasted away. He just wasted away. They knew he was going, and they called the family to say goodbye. His father was with him when the machines just stopped.
Obviously, Andy's family, friends, his immediate circle are just overwhelmed with grief, with shock. But in the old neighborhood in the North End, there were some folks who had a different reaction to his death. And it seems like the rumor mill immediately got started after Andy died. What did people say was going to happen?
Susan Warnock, who was a radio reporter then, she said nobody thought there would be a trial because the rumors were so strong that the mob was going to kill them in jail. The thinking goes the mob had a couple of motives. One thing, this murder cost them a lot of money in terms of revenues at the combat zone. And also this kid represents, the pride of the North End.
It sounds like the Puopolos would have had some exposure to members of the Angiulo family in their time in the North End. Yeah,
so Andrew Sr. knew all of them. He went to school with them, like grade school with them. And he was a Marine. He was in Iwo Jima, and he came back and he was offered a corner, and he politely turned it down because he was pretty straight-laced. You have plenty of mob exposure. People would come up to Danny all the time and said, don't worry, it's going to be taken care of. Don't worry, you're not going to have to go through a trial. It's going to be taken care of.
Just as a reminder, how old is Danny, the younger brother at this point?
Danny's 19 when this happens.
19.
And, he looks up to his brother. His brother is his everything. He still is.
Despite all the rumors that something was going to happen to the defendants, amazingly, all three of them were indicted the same morning that Andy died.
Yeah.
So just to introduce some of the characters that we're going to meet in the trial, we have at the defense table, Henry Owens. He was so excited about this case, he offered to take it pro bono. Why was that?
Henry Owens is a Black attorney. He's young at the time. His father owned Owens, I think, a moving company that was very successful. He could have gone into the business and it would have been easy, but he really, for civil rights, he went into law. He'd worked in the prosecutor's office, I think, in Middlesex County. He started his own defense firm and he wanted in on this trial. So he offers to represent Richard Allen pro bono so he can get the case.
He said at the time that his main concern before the trial started was Judge James Roy. So what was his reputation like that made Owens concerned?
Judge James Roy was known as the hanging judge. He was very, very favorable to the prosecution. Mm-hmm. Defense lawyers believed that he was chosen when it was important for the case, for the state to win the case, and that these three Black men were not going to get a fair trial with Judge Roy on the bench. Henry Owens called him an out-and-out racist.
In both the initial trial and then the appeal that gets a new trial, one of the key factors is the makeup of the jury. What made the makeup of a jury back then different than it is today?
So at the time, jurors were called in for like a month. So because jurors were called in for a month, they also allowed just a ton of exceptions for people who could claim financial difficulty. And that was basically anybody with a good job. Because so many people were granted exclusions, what you were left with was the very young, the very old, and union workers whose contract covered jury service. Also, the rolls came from registered voters, and Blacks did not register to vote at the same rate. So there weren't that many Blacks in the jury pool to start off with.
And then there were other considerations that would whittle that number down even further. You talk about the challenge process for jurors?
The way it works is they call, I think 185 people got called total. That's the jury pool. And then they get divided up into veneers, which go to the different cases. And then they go to the judge and the lawyers, the judge interviews them. They can be struck for two reasons. One is for cause. And for cause might be they've already made up their mind and they can't be fair. They're interviewed about their views. How much publicity have you heard? How has it affected you? Do you know anybody who's involved in this? Are you related to a cop? Are you related to a lawyer? And because the publicity was so massive, a lot of people were excused for cause. And it took a long time to seat a jury. In addition to being struck for cause, the lawyers were all given a certain amount of peremptory challenges. And these are challenges that they can just strike someone and they don't have to give a reason. The prosecutor winds up striking, I think it's 12 of 13 Black jurors, potential jurors, using his peremptory challenges. And they choose one token Black as a means of protection and they figure they're covered.
The sole Black juror was made the foreman, right? To make sure that he would still be there at the end of the trial.
Exactly. So they were covering their bets. They thought they were covering their bets.
So once we finally get a jury impaneled, what was Prosecutor Tom Mundy able to have the witnesses established? What was the narrative that he put together of what happened that night?
Tom Mundy, also to give you some background, was at the time the top prosecutor. Defense attorneys say that at the time there weren't a lot of great prosecutors. He really is a super intelligent guy and a really good prosecutor. He can try a case. So he has a super lot of evidence in this case. He's got 8 eyewitnesses. He's got witnesses from the street who weren't involved in it. He has witnesses who say, and these are the Harvard students, who say that when the black guys came after them, they said, "We are going to get you. We're going to cut you, whiteys." So Tom Mundy is going after the three of them using a joint venture. Mm-hmm. Even just being there and providing assistance so that the person feels they have the protection to stab somebody, that can be considered joint venture. Mundy is trying to establish joint venture two ways. He's establishing it by just the fact that they knew Easterling had a knife and he would use it, and then they follow him. They go with him to the alley, already knowing he had a knife and he used it on Tom Lincoln. That alone can establish joint venture. But he's also saying all three of them were protectors for the prostitute, that they came out to chase the Harvard football players, not because they saw a young black woman in distress, but because they were in on it and that they were doing it for a take of the wallet.
For the rest of the trial, which members of the family would attend, and then who would stay away besides Danny? So
in the first trial, Father Andrew Sr., he testifies, but he also goes, and his sister-in-law, Janice Puopolo, accompanies him. The family's told not to come because if you cry, and it's very painful for starters, but to hear all that, and if you cry out, that can cause a mistrial. So the prosecutor tells them not to come, and they don't.
One thing I was really struck by your description that Judge Roy, it seemed like he essentially couldn't tell Henry Owens apart from his client.
Yeah, he calls him Alan throughout the whole thing.
Do you get the impression that he was trying to put his thumb on the scale, or was he just confused about the identity of the attorney in front of him?
He does not like Henry Owens. That's very clear. And every time he objects to anything, immediately puts him down. I do think he was trying to show disrespect for his case.
Can you give us a sense of how each of the three attorneys capped off the trial with their closing statements?
So Henry Owens basically says my client is being tried for murder. His only crime is being a black man in the area. There's no testimony he touched Puopolo. There's no testimony he was involved in either fight. You can't convict somebody of murder for just being in the area. Suarez's lawyer, Hurley, says you can't use joint venture. This is nothing like a bank robbery. It doesn't apply. He is very derogative about his clients. He says basically they're just a product of he actually says, I don't put this in the book, but he says they're a product of the ghetto and you can't blame them, kind of. I mean, it's a very weak defense, I thought. And Wallace Sherman says, look, he's Easterling's lawyer, and Easterling says, look, we've heard testimony, Andrew Puopolo was a noble young man. He put his life at risk to save a friend. But if he was noble, so was Leon Easterling. He was saving his friend. Wallace Sherman said, you expect to believe that these Harvard boys, they were drinking all night, but they weren't drunk. This young prostitute forced her way into the van, But he concludes with the noble act, and I thought his closing was very compelling.
So the trial comes to its natural conclusion. We have the closing arguments by each of the defense attorneys. Tom Mundy delivers his masterfully crafted closing argument. But then what I was really struck by was the almost Byzantine complexity of the jury instructions that Judge Roy gave to the jurors. What were some of the scenarios that he had to prepare them to consider when they were going to go back and deliberate on this case?
Well, it is very complex because there's three different defendants, and then he has to explain joint venture. They believe they shared the intent, then they all have to go for first-degree murder. If they don't share the intent, or if you believe that Easterling was really trying to defend Suarez, then it could be manslaughter. It's very complicated. And I thought the judge did a good job with the jury instructions.
To the tune of hours, I think I read, of jury instruction.
Yeah. So it's a complicated case. I mean, both it's very, and it's hard for the jury to understand.
After all that, how long did it take to come to a verdict?
Not long. So I think they recess around noon, and they deliberate till 4 in the afternoon, and then they don't have a decision that day, but they have a decision at 10 8:15 the next morning. First-degree murder for all three men. And Soares has additional charges for the fight that took place where he kicked somebody, like assault and battery with a shod foot.
In Massachusetts at the time, first-degree murder carried an automatic sentence of life without possibility of parole. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, no, it still exists, I think.
They all got life sentences, and then almost immediately, public opinion starts to change in the months or the year or so after this trial concludes. What's happening to shift public opinion in the city of Boston about this case?
So this is where busing really comes into play. At the time when the Puopolo jury is called, whites are really still feeling quite put upon. But public sentiment is starting to change. Some of the violence is, there's more evidence of white violence against blacks. And then there's the case of Brian Nelson, which is just heinous, and it's in Medford. A carload of whites chases three black guys in a car, and they're all young. And it's a snowstorm, and the black guy's car spins out. They get out, and they get into a fight. And Brian Nelson, who was I think 18 at the time, gets stabbed to death with, I think, a broken Coke bottle and beaten with a tire iron. Immediately, the judge, all of the whites are arrested. The judge immediately lets all the other whites except a white Marine. But he never gets charged with murder. I think he gets charged with manslaughter. Then an all-white jury acquits him. The
contrast then to the Puopolo case is pretty extreme.
Yeah, the contrast, that provides a really strong contrast. And the city is changing. They're getting sick of busing. Louise Day Hicks is voted out. Pixie Palladino is voted out. The demographics of the city are changing too.
Hicks, who I think in 76 was the city council president, and 77 loses her council seat.
Yeah. So there's the case of a tourist group.
I think this example is going to resonate with our audience because we're all history nerds. And I'm sure many of our listeners have walked the Freedom Trail and walked up the many, many stairs of the Bunker Hill Monument. It's a private school, right? Maybe even a religious school from somewhere, I want to say in the Midwest.
Yeah. No, in Pennsylvania. They're coming to Boston to see the Bunker Hill Monument and clearly did not get the memo that you can't go to Charlestown if you're black. Mm-hmm. So they go, and on their way home, they get beaten by three white guys with hockey sticks. You can't be a tourist and go to a Bunker Hill Monument in this city without getting beaten. And the police go and they arrest three white guys and they bring them to trial. An all-white jury acquits the three hockey players. Now, there's so much violence. Black people are trying to move into Dorchester. They're getting their houses firebombed. And that's in the press. And the idea is so what good does it do if you arrest these guys if, an all-white jury is going to let them off?
The Puopolo case or the Puopolo trial is also sort of a turning point for the combat zone too, right? What changes happened there because of the trial?
It actually starts right after the murder, Mm-hmm. So the police, Suffolk County District Attorney and the new police chief, Joseph Jordan, just announced combat zone is a failure. It's basically a failed experiment. It's got to go. And so they go after all the strip clubs. And pretty soon Ray Flynn becomes mayor. He's very determined. He does everything he can to shut down the combat zone. I mean, he won't succeed, but he'll succeed in shrinking it.
A very affecting moment for the family that happens among all this is in the fall of 1977, which I think would be almost exactly a year after the crime or the attack. The city names a park after Andy.
Yes. So the North End gets together and they petition the city to rename the waterfront park where Andy Puopolo and his younger brother, they first began youth sports, and it becomes Andrew Puopolo Park. And that becomes political about who shows up and who doesn't. The governor shows up, the biggest anti-busing opponents show up, but Kevin White doesn't show up. Yeah, well, the tragedy for the Puopolo family, one of the many tragedies, their son's name becomes intertwined with, first with the combat zone, and now with racism.
So when I was 1 month old, in March 1979, the Supreme Judicial Court overturns the convictions in the Puopolo case.
Ah, okay, yeah.
What was the rationale behind the SJC decision?
The decision is interesting on a couple of levels. For one thing, shortly before they announced their decision, California, the High Court had been the first to say, you know what? These peremptory challenges, this use of peremptory challenges to get an all-white jury, that's racist. So the SJC says, you struck 12 out of 13 potential black jurors. That's a pattern of racism. They also reject all the defense's arguments that there wasn't enough evidence to convict all three men first-degree murder, that there was plenty of evidence to support joint venture. And so that's what the family sees. So that makes the setting aside of the convictions even more painful for the family. And
coming into a new trial, then there's a lot of turnover on both sides of the case. We have prosecutor Tom Mundy is going to try the case again the second time, and Henry Owens will continue representing Richard Allen. Everybody else turns over. And I think most importantly, I think you should introduce us to the new judge, but also just how did that change the second trial?
Well, let's start with the defense attorneys. So now you have Norman Zalkind and Henry Owens. A former prosecutor told me they're the kind of lawyers who give $50 of effort for every $1 of state fee, you know. They're very motivated. They're very bright. Norman Zalkind is a very, very savvy and smart lawyer. And Andrew Good is, he had worked for Henry Owens. So they have a completely well-prepared, aggressive, and savvy defense team. And then the new judge, is Judge McGuire. He's brought back from retirement from this case because he's known for his fairness.
To me, and you can correct me if this is a wrong impression, but that seems like almost a direct rebuke to Judge Roy's, the perception that he was sort of in the tank for the prosecution.
I think in this instance, the rebuke probably came with more on the jury selection part of it, because Owens was objecting every time a black juror was struck. And the judge was just saying, yeah, shut up. Basically. They need a new judge, and they get, they try to get one that is known for his fairness. The appeal is called the Suarez decision.
Okay.
It establishes new parameters for how lawyers can use their peremptory challenges. And the first time these new parameters are employed is in the second Puopolo trial. And it's like fireworks from the beginning. I think Mundy actually did a better job of proving that there was a joint venture scheme, that these defendants may have been involved in at least Easterling and Allen. I think where he falls down is I don't think Suarez was involved in it, and he's trying to lump them all together. I think the mistake he makes is by trying too hard to prove that Easterling and Allen they regularly worked for them. So Mundy tries to compensate from the way he questions Easterling about how could he have he's basically trying to prove he's a pimp. How can you have a gym membership with how can you have this? How can you have that? How can you have and he's got a white wife who is in the seating. He doesn't say it out loud, but he's pretty clear. He means, how can you have a white wife? And it sounds very demeaning and racist. And it turns the jury.
So eventually the jury goes away to deliberate. And I don't think anybody who served on a Suffolk County jury is eager to draw out the experience. But you have a funny note about why this particular jury might have been especially motivated to wrap things up quickly. What moved them along?
The trial started, I think, like on October 19th, and now it's November 22nd. Thanksgiving is the next day. So they want to go home. Defense attorneys told me that there was also a juror who was drinking too much and smelled. And they had asked to get the person removed, and the judge said no, and they wanted this over and done with. But they still deliberated 2.5 days, I think.
So more than the first time around.
Yeah, more than the first time around.
So what did they come back with in the end?
So they acquitted both Soares and Allen of all charges, and they found Easterling guilty only of manslaughter.
You introduced the concept of jury nullification. I'm not sure whether you would argue that it was a case of that, but you certainly bring it up as a possibility. What does that term mean?
So jury nullification came into kind of layman's speak during the O.J. Simpson trial. The argument was that jury, it wasn't necessarily saying that O.J. was innocent, but they were making a statement on the L.A. Police Department rather than on O.J. The term nullification means, in most instances, it means you're nullifying the law. Like, so during the Fugitive Slave Act, it was illegal to harbor slaves. Slaves would run away to New England, and then someone might get charged with aiding and assisting that and making them liable. They'd go to court, and no jury would convict them because the jury didn't agree with slavery. So it's when the jury consciously or unconsciously is making a statement on the law itself or on circumstances.
And in this case, the circumstances are the background of intense racial violence in the city.
Intense racial violence, and I think it's that the Globe had also done a spotlight series showing how all white juries had consistently sentenced blacks to longer sentences and to harsher prisons than whites for the same exact crime.
Whatever you or I might think about the justice of the verdict in the second trial, it seems like it had a really long-lasting impact on Danny Puopolo. How did his life change in the months and maybe the years following that second verdict?
Because so many people told him that it was going to get taken care of, he felt that it should be taken care of. They had offers to get them whacked in prison, and they put their faith in the criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system had failed them. He, as the remaining son, whose brother had always had his back and always been loyal to him, he felt it was his job to be loyal to his brother.
It sounds like Danny did stalk Richard Allen for maybe a decade after Andy's death.
Yes, well, it's pretty easy to stalk Richard Allen because he was always at the combat zone. But Edward Soares, I don't think he hung around the combat zone anymore. And Easterling was in prison. So he was in the combat zone all the time.
So how does Andy go from driving aimlessly around the combat zone, maybe fantasizing about doing something to Richard Allen, to hiring somebody or trying to hire someone to break Allen's legs?
Studies have since shown it's a really common response to murder. Murder is just a different kind of grief, and particularly hard on adolescents. It creates trauma. And Danny would, for periods, he would obsess on revenge, but then he was also very religious, and he would go to church on his knees praying to be delivered from this revenge.
What did Leon Easterling's release do to Danny Puopolo's state of mind?
It refocused him away from Richard Allen, who, after all, hadn't been the one to brutally murder his brother, to Leon Easterling. And the idea of Leon Easterling walking free was just incredibly painful for him. There are times when Danny can forget this. He is moving on with his life. He starts a successful business with his father. He marries, he has children. He's living a productive life, and he just has bouts of this. But sometimes he can't help it, and it returns.
It sounds like maybe one of the worst of those returns, or maybe the worst and last of those returns, was a couple years after Easterling's release. He talked himself into plotting a murder for hire scheme. Did he go through with that?
He made the initial inquiries, and he was about to set up a meeting. He was frustrated with himself for never kind of pulling the trigger, but I don't think he was ever going to pull the trigger. I think early on, maybe when he was 19 years old, if he had encountered them in a dark alley when it was all fresh, who knows what might have happened. But I think as the years progressed, it was part of his grief as opposed to a real plan. His good friend says to him, Andy was going to be a doctor. He was going to heal people. He would not, because he kept thinking he had to do this for his brother. It was his obligation to do this for his brother. And his friend convinced him, it's not for your brother. Your brother wouldn't want this. And then the friend said the way to honor him is to tell his story. Tell his story.
besides participating in your book, how has he told Andy's story?
Well, originally when he decided to do it, they were going to do a film, and they had a Hollywood director who was a classmate, at Harvard with Andy. And when I got involved, I said, I'll do the screenplay on spec on condition I can do a book in the way I see it. I don't know if this book is healing for Danny. I think maybe it didn't accomplish what he wanted it to do, because I did see things differently. But he's done what he can to tell his brother's story. And
is Danny doing okay these days? I
think he is. They're a very strong, very together family. And I think someone else in the same circumstances, I don't know what would have happened to them.
So I appreciate you spending as much time with me today on this conversation as you have. And as I get ready to let you go, if our listeners want to follow you or your work online, where should they look for that?
Well, my website, www.janbrogan.com. Also, you can follow me on Instagram, Jan Brogan with a _ at the end, or look me up on Facebook or Twitter, Jan Brogan.
No underscore.
No underscore.
And are there book events in the Boston area that people can come out, meet you, learn more?
I'm going to be speaking it's through the Tewksbury Library, but it's a multi-library virtual event. And I'll be talking about how the 1976 murder left a lasting imprint on the city, state, and on criminal justice. And I will be at the New England Crime Bait November 12th and 13th. That's really for mystery. I'll be talking on a true crime panel. I think that might be sold out. And I'm going to be speaking December 8th as part of the Master List Book Club Author Talk. I'm going to be interviewed. And to register for that virtual event, you need to go to Master List, which is a free newsletter from State House News.
And we'll make sure to link to all the events in the show notes this week, as well as linking to a way that you can purchase the book, which once again is The Combat Zone: Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice by Jan Brogan. Jan, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today.
This was a lot of fun. You're a great interviewer.
Thanks. To learn more about Jan Brogan, The Combat Zone: Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice, and the Puopolo case, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/236. We'll have an affiliate link where you can support Hub History and your favorite local bookstores when you buy a copy of Jan's The Combat Zone. I'll also link to a December 1976 WCVB news report about the Puopolo case, as well as a handful of Globe stories about the case. Plus, I'll have links to Jan Brogan's website and social media profiles, as well as details about our upcoming book events at the Tewksbury Library and the New England Crime Bake. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop us a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.